I'm Betty, 67 years old, and I rushed home for my passport. Through the window, I heard my daughter and son-in-law. She'll never know. The money's ours now. My hand trembled on the doorknob. What else were they hiding? Before I continue my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want more stories about family betrayal and revenge. Trust me, what happened next will show you exactly why no one should underestimate a woman who has nothing left to lose. I had planned the trip for months and saved every spare dollar while cutting back on groceries and skipping repairs around the house so I could finally take a vacation for the first time in decades. But now I stood frozen as I realized my daughter and her husband were sitting in my home calmly discussing how to strip me of everything I owned and declare me incapable of managing my own affairs. They said I was getting too independent lately because I had started joining a local club, making new friends, and even dared to plan a trip alone, as if those small acts of joy were signs of mental decline rather than proof I was finally living after burying my husband and spending 3 years in mourning, while they offered hollow words of support only to push me into decisions that benefited them. I realized they had been working for months to poison the perception of everyone around me by telling neighbors, family friends, and even my doctor that I was becoming forgetful, confused, and reckless, when the truth was that I had been the one to manage their debts for years, co-signed their loans when no one else trusted them, and even emptied part of my retirement savings to help them buy their first house because they said it was for my future comfort too. They called my cruise a dangerous and selfish waste of money, but they never once hesitated to demand help with their vacations, their cars, their renovations, or even their private medical treatments, and every time I gave in, they promised they would take care of me in my old age. Yet here they were scheming to sell my house and lock me away so they could enjoy the fruits of my labor. I remembered how many times I cooked their meals, babysat their children for days at a time without thanks, and handed over money with no questions asked even when I suspected they were being irresponsible, and now they labeled me as irrational for wanting to see the world before my body gave out, and my knees completely failed me. I felt my chest tighten as I realized they planned to photograph my documents, forge my signature on certain forms, and use fabricated stories to convince a judge I was unfit, and the thought of being dragged into a court where my own daughter would testify against me sent a cold wave of rage through my veins as I gripped the doorknob harder to keep myself from collapsing under the weight of betrayal. They spoke of my house as if it were already theirs to divide and sell, ignoring the fact that I had spent 40 years making mortgage payments, fixing every leak and crack, and sacrificing vacations, new clothes, and even proper dental care just to keep the family home in perfect shape for them to inherit one day. But now they couldn't even wait for me to die naturally. I heard them laughing about how easy it would be to convince my best friend to provide false testimony because she already believed their lies about my memory lapses, and the realization that they had even corrupted my most trusted confidant made my stomach turn as I thought about how deeply they had woven this web of deception, while smiling sweetly in my face every Sunday. The injustice was staggering because I had raised my daughter alone after her father left, worked 2 jobs to pay for her college education, and even took on cleaning shifts at night to cover her wedding costs. But none of that loyalty mattered to her now that I was seen as a financial burden standing in the way of their dream lifestyle. I thought about the small jewelry pieces that had gone missing over the past few months and how I had blamed my own forgetfulness. But now I realized they had probably been testing how far they could go without arousing suspicion, and the thought that I had apologized for accusing them when I first noticed made my blood boil, as I understood I had been gaslight for years. I remembered when my daughter had suggested I add her name to my accounts to help with the bills, and how I had almost agreed before my late husband's voice seemed to whisper a warning in my head, and now I saw how dangerously close I had come to handing them complete control of my life without a fight. I thought about every sleepless night I had spent worrying about their financial problems, and every time I had denied myself small luxuries like new shoes or even fresh flowers so I could lend them just one more dollar to keep them afloat. And now I understood they had never seen those sacrifices as love, but as weakness to exploit. I felt my knees shaking but forced myself to breathe slowly because I realized I couldn't let them know I had overheard their plans. And in that moment, I made the first of many decisions that would change the trajectory of this battle because I decided I would not confront them now but instead let them believe I was the clueless old woman they thought they had outsmarted. I turned away from the window and moved silently to my desk where the passport lay buried under a stack of neatly filed papers because I had always been meticulous about my records. And as I slipped it into my bag, I made another decision that this trip would not be about relaxation anymore, but about gathering information and building a plan to take back the power they were so eager to steal from me. I picked up my phone and quickly sent a message to an old acquaintance who had once worked in law enforcement asking if they knew any trustworthy private investigators, because I knew I would need evidence, documentation, and allies to fight back. And I felt a strange surge of strength as I realized I had lived too long, worked too hard, and loved too deeply to let it all end with betrayal. I walked back to the door as I heard the taxi driver's horn blaring impatiently and forced a calm expression onto my face because appearances would now become my greatest weapon. And as I stepped outside and waved to the driver, I thought about how satisfying it would be to one day watch my daughter and her husband learn the price of underestimating a woman who had nothing left to lose. I stayed silent during the entire drive to the airport while my mind replayed every word I had overheard, and I forced myself to plan carefully because I understood now that my daughter and son-in-law had been laying the groundwork for years by planting stories about my supposed confusion and erratic behavior to anyone who would listen so they could create the appearance of mental decline when in reality I had been the one supporting them emotionally and financially through every crisis they had caused for themselves. They told my doctor I had been missing appointments and forgetting medications even though I had kept meticulous records of every visit and prescription refill because I learned decades ago to document everything after being burned once by an insurance error. And they told neighbors I was becoming paranoid and distrustful when I stopped lending them money after realizing they never repaid me and used my savings for luxuries I could never afford for myself. I remembered when my daughter accused me of being irrational for questioning why her husband suddenly had access to my accounts, and I felt a wave of disgust as I realized I had believed her tears when she said she only wanted to help me manage my finances as I aged, but now I understood that was the first step of their plan to take over entirely. They have lied to my friends at the book club about my memory lapses and repeated stories so they could build a narrative that made me look like an unreliable narrator of my own life. And I knew now that even my closest confidant had been manipulated to see me as a fragile old woman incapable of handling basic tasks because Heather had whispered poison into her ear under the guise of concern. They said I was impulsive for planning a trip alone, but they never called themselves impulsive for using my credit cards to buy designer furniture and expensive vacations they posted on social media as if they earned it all themselves, and the hypocrisy burned in my chest as I realized how long they had hidden their contempt behind fake gratitude. They claimed I was erratic for selling an old investment account last year without consulting them even though it was my own money and I had used it to pay for essential home repairs they refused to help with despite promising they would take care of me once they got back on their feet. But they never considered their constant requests for loans as signs of irresponsibility or dependency. I thought about the jewelry I had noticed missing from my bedroom and the small antique items that had disappeared from the shelves, and I now understood that those were tests to see how much they could take without my noticing, so they could later argue I was careless and unfit to manage my possessions. I remembered every time Heather gently suggested I should consider moving into a smaller place because a big house is too much for one person, and every time Jason offered to handle my mail and bills because it's easier for younger people to keep up, and I saw now how each offer of help had been a calculated step toward total control of my assets. I felt a surge of anger when I realized how they must have laughed behind my back each time I praised their kindness and told others how lucky I was to have such supportive family, while they were documenting my every small mistake to build a false case against me, and I clenched my fists in the back seat of the taxi to stop my hands from shaking as I thought about how much I wanted them to pay for their betrayal. They believe I am weak because I am old, but they have no idea that I have spent my entire life overcoming obstacles and fighting for survival when everyone else expected me to fail, and I refuse to let them take what I built with my blood and sweat just because they are too lazy and entitled to earn their own way. I thought about the times I had paid Heather's tuition bills, covered Jason's medical expenses after his accident, and even paid for their honeymoon because they claimed they couldn't afford it. And now I realize they viewed those sacrifices not as love, but as proof I was a fool to be exploited until I had nothing left. I remembered when Jason convinced me to give him a copy of my house key by saying he wanted to check on the property while I was away years ago, and I now saw that moment for what it was. The opening move of a long con designed to make me trust him enough to hand over access to everything. I felt my jaw tighten as I realized they had likely already planned which care facility to place me in once they secured guardianship, because they spoke with such casual cruelty about keeping me comfortable, as if I were a piece of furniture they needed to store out of sight. I pulled out my phone and began writing a detailed message to an attorney I had met years ago when settling Roberto's estate, because I knew I would need legal advice on how to lock down my assets and prepare for a possible fight in court. And as I typed, I felt the first embers of a quiet rage that would soon grow into a fire neither of them could extinguish. I decided I would hire a private investigator to monitor them while I was gone, because if they believed I was vulnerable enough to leave unprotected, they would likely escalate their plans and make mistakes that could be documented as evidence against them. I realized I would also need to secretly change my will and power of attorney to prevent Heather and Jason from gaining automatic access to my estate, and I made a mental note to set appointments with my financial advisor and bank manager as soon as I returned from the trip. They think I am blind because I have been generous, but they will soon learn that the woman who raised a daughter alone, paid off a mortgage without help, and survived every betrayal life threw at her is not someone who will go quietly into a nursing home while they sell offer memories. I felt a strange calm settle over me as I entered the airport terminal and checked in for my flight, because I knew now that I would use every ounce of strength, cunning, and patience I possessed to turn their plan against them. And as I boarded the plane, I promised myself that this would not be a vacation of rest, but a journey to gather allies, information, and weapons for the fight of my life. I spent the entire flight reviewing every interaction of the past few years in my mind while cataloging every instance where Heather and her husband had subtly undermined my confidence, because I now understood that their pattern of suggesting I was forgetful, clumsy, or too trusting had been a deliberate campaign to isolate me and create the illusion that I could no longer make sound decisions, even though I had handled my own affairs flawlessly for decades without needing anyone's guidance. I remembered the time Heather asked for copies of my bank statements under the pretense of helping me with taxes, and how I dismissed my initial hesitation as ungratefulness because I had raised her to believe in family solidarity. But now I could see that moment as one of many small betrayals where my trust became a tool for their manipulation. I felt an icy determination growing stronger with each passing hour, because I realized I had been giving them the benefit of the doubt for far too long while they had been documenting my every minor error and using it as ammunition in private conversations with neighbors, friends, and professionals to build a narrative of declines so convincing that even I had started to second-guess myself at times when I misplaced keys or forgot a grocery item. They had no idea that I had already texted the attorney I trusted to discreetly schedule a meeting upon my return, so we could discuss legal strategies to protect my assets and preempt any guardianship claim. And I also arranged through an acquaintance for a private investigator to install discreet surveillance equipment in my home during my absence to ensure every act of intrusion and theft would be recorded in high definition. I knew their arrogance would lead them to believe I had left the house unguarded, and that assumption would embolden them to accelerate their plan while I was out of the country, which made this the perfect opportunity to gather undeniable evidence of their duplicity and prepare for a counterattack they would never see coming. I remembered all the times Heather reassured me that she and her husband were only concerned about my well-being when they pressed me to downsize and sell the house, but in truth they were eager to convert my lifelong sacrifice into liquid assets to fund their own extravagant lifestyle, without regard for my comfort, security, or dignity. They said I was too attached to material possessions and unable to see the practicality of moving into assisted living, even though I had maintained the house single-handedly for years and had no trouble managing my routines. And their hypocrisy was breathtaking because they clung to my resources while criticizing my independence as a weakness instead of a strength. I could not erase the memory of hearing Heather laugh when she said I might not even notice if they started removing valuables because she believed I was no longer attentive enough to recognize small changes, and that realization hardened my resolve to document every item in the house and create a detailed inventory with my attorney so I could hold them accountable for anything that went missing. I decided I would also change the locks and revoke any spare keys they held without informing them because their access was no longer a gesture of family trust, but a liability that placed me in direct danger from the people I had loved and supported most in this world. I thought about Jason's repeated offers to help me manage online accounts and passwords because I now recognize those attempts as part of a calculated effort to take control of my finances before I even realized I had been sidelined, and I could no longer afford to dismiss such intrusions as harmless overreach. They claimed my decisions to spend money on personal enjoyment were frivolous and irresponsible, but they never called their own reckless spending on luxury cars, expensive vacations, and home renovations wasteful because they saw themselves as entitled to comfort even if it came at my expense. I reflected on the cruel irony that I had once believed Heather would protect me in my old age the way I had protected her as a child, but instead she viewed my aging not as a chance to repay my love, but as an opportunity to seize control and erase my autonomy. I felt a surge of quiet satisfaction as I realized I now had the advantage because their overconfidence had blinded them to the possibility that I might fight back, and their failure to recognize my determination would be their undoing because I intended to outmaneuver them at every turn. I plan to use my time abroad to document all my legal and financial records digitally and secure backups in multiple locations so they could not destroy or alter evidence to strengthen their case against me. And I would also create a written statement of my intentions and mental state to leave no doubt of my capacity should any dispute arise. I remembered the last conversation I had with Heather before leaving when she smiled sweetly and reminded me to call if I became confused about my itinerary, and I felt my stomach twist with revulsion as I realized that every affectionate gesture had been nothing more than a performance meant to keep me pliable while they set their trap. They underestimated me because they believed their narrative of decline was already accepted by everyone around me, but they forgot that I am the same woman who raised a child on her own, balanced 2 jobs, and paid off a mortgage in a world that expected me to fail, and I was prepared to show them exactly how dangerous it is to corner someone who has nothing left to lose. As I landed in my destination country and turned on my phone, I saw a confirmation message from the private investigator saying the installation of cameras and motion sensors had been completed without issue, and I felt a calm determination settle over me because I knew the first phase of my counterattack had begun even before Heather and Jason realized they were already under surveillance. The first message from the private investigator arrived on my second day abroad confirming that Heather and Jason had entered my home within hours of my departure under the pretense of checking on the property, but their real intention quickly became clear when the investigators' surveillance footage captured them rifling through my desk drawers, photographing documents, and whispering about how to discreetly remove items of value without raising suspicion upon my return. I watched the videos in silence as Jason picked up my jewelry box and examined its contents while Heather created a checklist on her phone of which pieces would fetch the highest prices, and I felt the weight of every past kindness I had shown them turning into bitter lead in my stomach because they had once sworn they would never take a single thing from me without my blessing, yet here they were treating my life's possessions as merchandise to be liquidated. They found my file of bank records and retirement statements and discussed how easy it would be to convince a judge that I was incapable of managing my finances because I kept too many paper copies of everything, and they mocked my careful organization as the behavior of someone obsessed and outdated even though that system had allowed me to maintain financial stability for decades while they drowned in debt from reckless decisions. I received an alert later that day showing Heather contacting my doctor under the guise of concern and implying I had shown signs of paranoia and confusion during recent visits, so she could begin compiling statements to support their case for guardianship. And I realized with sick clarity that even my medical professionals were being drawn into their web of lies because they trusted her fabricated narrative over my long history of independence and competence. The investigators sent still images of Jason removing several envelopes from my locked filing cabinet after Heather supplied him with the spare key I had entrusted to her years ago when I believed she was a daughter who would protect my interests, and I clenched my fists so tightly my nails dug into my palms as I imagined the ease with which they betrayed that sacred trust for personal gain. I felt my anger sharpen into resolve when the investigator informed me they overheard Jason calling a real estate agent to inquire discreetly about the value of my house under the pretense of helping me downsize, but their conversation revealed they were planning to prepare the property for sale even before any legal authority had been granted to them, and I understood that they fully intended to strip me of my home, my identity, and my autonomy without a second thought. I recalled how many times Heather had reassured me that everything she did was for my future comfort while asking for financial help, and I felt a cold surge of fury as I saw the proof that her true motive was always her own future comfort at the expense of my freedom and dignity. They laughed while speculating about how much time I might have left before my health declined to the point where even friends and neighbors would believe their claims of dementia, and I felt a bitter satisfaction knowing that every cruel word they spoke was now preserved in crystal-clear recordings that would later serve as their undoing. I instructed the investigator to catalog every item they touched, every document they photographed, and every drawer they searched, because I intended to confront them with undeniable evidence of their betrayal and force them to face the reality of the crimes they believed they were committing in secret. They believe they are clever for exploiting my absence, but they do not realize that every movement they make is now documented from multiple angles, and their arrogance will only make it easier to destroy their scheme in its entirety when the time comes. I felt no remorse for the steps I had taken to protect myself because I remembered too clearly the years I had spent denying myself small luxuries to support their lifestyle, including cashing out a modest pension early to cover Heather's emergency medical bills when Jason's insurance refused to pay, and yet they repaid that sacrifice with calculated cruelty and greed. They think I will return from my trip oblivious to their theft and deception, but I am already preparing my legal response by coordinating with my attorney to secure protective orders that will bar them from accessing my accounts, my property, and any authority over my medical care or estate decisions. I remembered how Heather once said I was stubborn for refusing to delegate my finances to her because she claimed managing them alone was a burden at my age, and I now saw that suggestion for what it was: a thinly veiled attempt to gain direct control of everything I owned while portraying herself as a caring daughter. The investigators sent one final report that evening detailing how Jason had taken photographs of every valuable painting and heirloom in the house, while Heather drafted a list of potential buyers for the most expensive items, and I felt a rising sense of calm as I realized that each greedy act only added another layer to the case I was building against them. They underestimate me because I have never fought them before, but they will soon learn that I have been fighting my entire life, first for survival as a single mother and then for security as a widow, and I will not hesitate to use every weapon at my disposal to protect what remains of my dignity and independence. I realized the time for subtlety was almost over because their betrayal had escalated far beyond whispered conversations and into outright theft and fraud, and I resolved that the next phase of my strategy would involve striking back in ways they could never anticipate. The private investigator sent me a detailed timeline showing that within 48 hours of my departure, Jason had withdrawn cash from one of my accounts using a forged signature authorization form that Heather had prepared in advance, while she contacted 2 different financial institutions to inquire about transferring ownership of my accounts, citing fabricated concerns about my cognitive decline. And I felt my blood turn cold as I realized how deeply they had embedded themselves in every corner of my life with the single goal of stripping me of everything I had worked for. They spoke openly in my kitchen about how they would sell my house as soon as they obtained legal guardianship because they believed I would no longer be capable of contesting their actions in court, and they even argued over whether to send me to a nearby care facility or relocate me to a private institution farther away to reduce the likelihood of anyone questioning their narrative. And the sheer audacity of deciding my future without consulting me enraged me in a way I had never felt before. The investigators' footage revealed Jason instructing Heather to call my insurance provider and claim I had been mismanaging my medications and failing to attend appointments so they could obtain medical records that would bolster their fabricated case. And I clenched my fists as I remembered all the times I had carefully scheduled and attended those very appointments alone because neither of them had ever offered to accompany me or even check on how I was feeling afterward. I reviewed the digital files the investigator had compiled, including screenshots of Heather messaging one of my closest friends to warn her that I had been displaying worrying signs of confusion and memory loss, and I realized with nauseating clarity that even my social circle had been carefully poisoned to view me as a helpless old woman rather than a competent adult capable of managing her own affairs. I remembered the countless sacrifices I had made over decades, including selling family heirlooms to cover Heather's first down payment, lending Jason large sums of money after his failed business ventures, and covering their legal fees during a lawsuit they never admitted was their fault. Yet here they were conspiring to reduce me to nothing more than a passive figurehead in my own life. The injustice was overwhelming because they criticized my financial prudence as controlling while expecting me to bankroll their every whim without question, and now they mocked my cautious spending habits as symptoms of paranoia and obsession to justify seizing control of assets they never earned. I instructed the investigator to begin documenting their communications with Dr. R., a physician I had trusted for years, because Heather had persuaded him to submit a preliminary report suggesting I undergo evaluation for cognitive decline, even though he had no evidence of any such issue and had only my daughter's fabricated accounts of my supposed confusion to rely on. They believe I am powerless to stop them because I have allowed them access for too long, but they do not understand that I am already working with my attorney to revoke all legal permissions I had granted them and to secure emergency injunctions that will prevent any further tampering with my finances, property, or medical decisions. I arranged for my attorney to engage a second independent medical professional to perform a thorough assessment upon my return because I wanted a contemporaneous record of my cognitive health to refute any false claims, and I felt a sense of grim satisfaction, knowing that Heather's plan to portray me as unstable would collapse under the weight of actual evidence. The private investigator discovered that Jason was maintaining a separate apartment across town where he lived with a second woman and 2 young children, and I felt a sharp jolt of recognition as I remembered all the late nights and unexplained absences he had attributed to work obligations, realizing now that Heather herself was also a pawn in a larger scheme built on deceit and manipulation. They think I am oblivious because I am old, but I have survived the kind of hardships that would break most people, and I am not afraid to confront them with the full weight of their betrayal once I have gathered every piece of evidence necessary to dismantle their carefully constructed lies. I sent instructions to my attorney to initiate proceedings that would freeze any pending transactions on my property and assets while issuing cease and desist letters to prevent Jason and Heather from making further attempts to access my accounts under false pretenses, and I felt a growing sense of control returning as each protective measure fell into place. I realized that the woman I had once believed was my loving daughter had been systematically rewriting the story of my life so she could step into the role of savior and caretaker for appearances while quietly stripping me of agency, freedom, and dignity behind closed doors. I felt no hesitation as I authorized the investigator to install additional hidden audio recorders in key areas of my home because I anticipated they would escalate their efforts, and I wanted every word and every act of theft or fraud preserved to ensure they would face legal consequences for their betrayal. They see me as nothing more than an obstacle to their ambitions, but they will soon understand that I've become their greatest threat because I am no longer blinded by love or loyalty, and I am prepared to destroy every illusion they have built around themselves. The investigator reported that Jason had begun contacting appraisers and auction houses about my antiques under the guise of helping me declutter, and I felt an icy calm as I made a mental inventory of every item in my house, knowing that I would confront him later with proof of his attempts to liquidate my assets without my consent. I reminded myself that patience was now my greatest weapon because each reckless step they took while believing I was unaware only tightened the legal trap I was setting around them, and I resolved to continue letting them believe I was the naive, helpless old woman they imagined while quietly orchestrating their downfall from a distance. The private investigators' updates confirmed that Jason had returned to my house multiple times that week with a large duffel bag and left each visit with boxes and smaller items that he loaded into his car trunk while Heather remained at home sending text messages to various contacts. And I felt my stomach tighten with rage because they believed my years of meticulous organization would collapse under their carelessness, when in reality, I had documented every possession with photographs and receipts long before they ever imagined taking control of my estate. They had removed family heirlooms, including jewelry that belonged to my grandmother and small antiques my late husband treasured, and Heather even went so far as to post photographs of some pieces to online marketplaces under a pseudonym, while discussing with Jason which items would be least likely to be missed immediately, so they could avoid detection before filing their guardianship petition. The investigator discovered that Jason had also approached a family lawyer to inquire about power of attorney transfers, using a fabricated story about my inability to manage household expenses, and I felt my hands clench as I realized how easily they lied about my supposed decline to strangers while presenting themselves as concerned caretakers rather than predators dismantling my life piece by piece. They believe my independence is a threat to their ambitions because they fear my ability to think clearly and act decisively, but they are too arrogant to consider the possibility that I have already begun protecting myself by locking down accounts, securing legal representation, and gathering overwhelming evidence of their betrayal. I remembered every time Heather had asked me to sign routine documents under the pretense of updating records or simplifying finances, and I shuddered at the realization that I had narrowly avoided authorizing transfers and legal changes that would have left me penniless and dependent on the very people plotting to lock me away. The injustice is unbearable because I had trusted them to safeguard my future, and they responded by strategizing how to erase me from my own home and consign me to a care facility where they planned to visit rarely, if at all, while spending the proceeds of my life's work on their luxuries. I felt a cold, deliberate calm as I authorized my attorney to begin drafting legal documents to block any potential guardianship petition and to initiate the process of updating my will so that neither Heather nor Jason would receive a single cent should anything happen to me, because I could no longer risk allowing either of them to benefit from my death. They mocked my cautious habits as paranoia when they spoke in private about how I kept multiple copies of important papers in different locations, but that very diligence now made it impossible for them to completely erase my trail or destroy the evidence I needed to defend myself. I instructed the investigator to expand surveillance to include Heather's personal phone and online activities, which quickly revealed she had been sharing details of my accounts and property with a close friend who was helping her identify potential buyers for my assets, and I felt a flash of anger as I realized how far her betrayal extended beyond our family circle. They believe I am fragile because of my age, but they underestimate the strength I have built from decades of hardship, including raising Heather alone after her father abandoned us and working 2 jobs to ensure she had every opportunity for success, and I will not allow that strength to be dismissed as senility. The investigator's latest report showed Jason withdrawing cash from one of Heather's accounts and transferring it to support his second household, which included 2 young children who called him Dad, and a woman who believed she was in a committed relationship with a hard-working man providing for his family, and I felt a dark satisfaction knowing that I now possessed a weapon powerful enough to fracture their alliance from within. They see themselves as invincible because they have spent years conditioning me to doubt my judgment and rely on their advice, but they will soon learn that I've been quietly reclaiming every piece of power they thought they had taken away. I sent instructions to my attorney to prepare a motion for emergency restraining orders preventing both Heather and Jason from entering my home or accessing any of my accounts, and I made arrangements to have all locks changed and new security systems installed as soon as I returned to ensure they would never again cross my threshold without consequence. The investigator confirmed that Heather had drafted a list of care facilities with notes on which ones offered the least oversight and lowest visitation requirements, and the realization that they intended to disappear me into an institution while enjoying the fruits of my labor solidified my resolve to fight them with every resource at my disposal. They underestimate the depth of my determination because they have never seen me in battle before, but I've spent my life surviving betrayals and hardships that would have broken lesser people, and this time I intend to strike first, and without hesitation. I coordinated with my attorney to schedule a meeting with law enforcement officials upon my return because I wanted to ensure that the evidence I now held would lead to criminal charges and prevent any future attempts to reclaim access to my life or property. They believe I will come home grateful for their interference and blind to their crimes, but they will be greeted instead by a legal barricade and a mother who no longer sees them as family, but as adversaries to be dismantled with precision and resolve. The investigator's final report arrived as I packed for my return flight, confirming that Heather and Jason had begun moving larger furniture pieces out of my house under the pretense of helping me declutter for safety. And they even joked on camera about how I would not notice their absence because they were convinced my memory had deteriorated enough to make me doubt my own surroundings, which revealed the depth of their contempt for my intelligence and awareness. I reviewed the footage in silence, noting every item removed, including heirloom chairs, small tables, and even boxed photo albums containing decades of family memories that I had carefully preserved because I understood they intended to sell the furniture and discard the albums since my history and legacy held no monetary value for them, and I felt my jaw tighten as I watched Jason carry those boxes with the same hands I had once trusted to help repair my home. They believe I will return docile and unaware, but they have no idea that I am arriving with my attorney, the police, and the private investigator ready to confront them with the full weight of their crimes while they still believe they are untouchable. I remembered every warning sign I ignored over the years, including Heather's constant suggestions to simplify my finances and Jason's repeated offers to take over my bill payments so I could relax in my old age. And I realize now that those small gestures were never acts of kindness, but calculated steps to erode my autonomy. The injustice burns deeply because I sacrificed everything for Heather's future, including selling my car to pay for her graduate program when I could have used those funds to upgrade my own home, and now she seeks to repay me by stealing the very roof I built over her head as a child. I authorized my attorney to file emergency motions while I was still abroad so that court orders would be in place before I even set foot back in my city, and I instructed the private investigator to deliver copies of their surveillance footage directly to law enforcement so there would be no delay in opening a formal investigation. They mocked my independence as a flaw and ridiculed my careful documentation habits as evidence of paranoia, yet those same habits provided me with the meticulous records needed to prove their theft, forgery, and fraud in court, and I felt an icy satisfaction, knowing their arrogance had become my greatest asset in dismantling their scheme. The investigator discovered Jason had also been using my absence to visit his second family more frequently and transferring small amounts of cash from Heather's accounts to support them without her knowledge, and I saw with clarity how his betrayal extended in multiple directions, leaving even Heather as another victim of his deception, though it did not absolve her of her own crimes against me. They believe they hold all the power because they see me as an aging woman with no fight left, but they are unaware that I have already arranged for law enforcement to accompany me to the house where they will serve warrants and seize the stolen property before any further damage can be done. I remembered the countless nights I stayed awake worrying about their financial struggles and praying they would find stability, never imagining those same people would spend hours plotting my removal from my home so they could liquidate my life's work and live comfortably on its proceeds. The injustice feels suffocating because Heather once told me she would never abandon me in my later years, and even swore on her children's lives that I would always be safe in her care. But those promises now ring hollow as I prepare to face her as a legal adversary rather than as a daughter. I felt a cold surge of clarity as I reviewed my plan with my attorney, confirming that Heather and Jason would be met with a coordinated legal and law enforcement response that would leave no room for excuses, denials, or further manipulation of the narrative they had spun so carefully. They believe I am powerless because they do not understand the strength born from decades of hardship, and they will learn the hard way that I have no intention of letting them write the ending to my story. I stepped off the plane with my attorney and the private investigator waiting at arrivals holding folders thick with evidence, and as we drove toward my home, I rehearsed the sequence of events we had planned because I knew that every second mattered to catch Heather and Jason off guard before they could destroy or hide anything that might still be inside. The investigator confirmed in a whispered update that Heather was in the house sorting through my remaining financial documents while Jason loaded more boxes into his car, and I felt a surge of cold determination as I realized how close they were to completing their theft and erasing every physical trace of my life's achievements. They believe I am returning unaware and grateful for their help, but they do not realize they are about to face a coordinated legal strike designed to strip them of their access, their false sense of control, and their freedom in one calculated move. I remembered the years I spent denying myself small comforts to support Heather's education and Jason's recovery after his failed ventures, while trusting they would one day honor my sacrifices with care and respect. Yet here they were treating my absence as an invitation to dismantle everything I had built and discard the pieces like unwanted debris. The injustice is staggering because I had once signed over temporary account access during Heather's difficult pregnancy, believing her husband's promise to use it only in emergencies. But now I see that trust as the very opening they exploited to plan this wholesale looting of my life. We arrived in silence as my attorney signaled the waiting officers to move in first to secure the property, while the investigators set up video recording of the entire confrontation to ensure every reaction and every attempt at denial would be preserved for legal proceedings. They think they are clever for acting during my trip, but their laughter caught on surveillance while discussing how easy it was to fool a lonely old woman will now become evidence of premeditation when presented in court to prove malice and intent. I felt no pity as I watched Jason emerge from the garage carrying another box of stolen heirlooms, only to freeze in shock as uniformed officers approached him, and I felt no hesitation as I exited the car and walked directly toward Heather, who had stepped onto the porch pale and trembling at the sight of law enforcement surrounding her childhood home. They believe their roles as daughter and son-in-law grant them immunity from consequence, but they are about to learn that betrayal of this magnitude carries a cost far beyond anything they imagined when they first began their quiet campaign to erase me from my own life. I remembered Heather's words from the surveillance recordings mocking my supposed confusion and insisting I would never fight back because she's too old to understand what's happening. And I felt an almost electric calm knowing she would now see just how much she had underestimated the woman who raised her to stand on her own 2 feet. The injustice of their betrayal no longer stung like an open wound because it had hardened into a weapon I intended to wield without hesitation as my attorney presented them with cease and desist orders, property reclamation notices, and documentation of every theft, forgery, and fraudulent act they had committed during my absence. They believe they are victims of an overreaction, but they will soon face a barrage of charges and civil actions that will dismantle their finances, reputations, and any hope of claiming even a single cent from my estate in the future. I stood silently as officers escorted Jason to a patrol car in handcuffs while Heather's face twisted between shock, anger, and fear as my attorney handed her the restraining order preventing her from entering my property or accessing any of my accounts ever again. And I felt no sympathy as she stammered questions about why this was happening because every cruel word she had spoken and every greedy act she had taken was already documented in detail and submitted to the court. They believed their years of quiet manipulation and careful lies had built an unassailable narrative that painted them as my protectors, but they had underestimated my ability to gather allies, build a case, and strike back with precision after months of watching them dismantle my life piece by piece. I remembered every Sunday afternoon they had spent sitting in my living room sipping coffee and pretending to care about my health while secretly debating how soon they could sell my house, and I felt an icy satisfaction knowing those very visits had provided some of the clearest surveillance evidence of their intentions. The injustice burns deeply because I once believed Heather's promises that she would never let anyone mistreat me in my later years, yet she became the architect of my betrayal, orchestrating every lie and manipulation to position herself as the concerned daughter, while quietly stealing from the mother who gave up her youth to give her the life she enjoys. I felt the weight of years of sacrifice lift slightly as officers carried out boxes containing my heirlooms and documents Heather and Jason had packed for sale, and I watched without a word as each box was checked against my meticulous inventories, proving that nothing had been misplaced by accident, but rather as part of a systematic campaign of theft. They believe their relationship with me will shield them from prosecution, but they will soon learn that I have no intention of letting blood ties or shared history absolve them from facing the full legal and moral consequences of their actions. I authorized my attorney to proceed with civil suits to recover damages for emotional distress and financial losses caused by their fraudulent activities, and I made it clear that any attempt to approach me or contest my decisions would result in immediate escalation of criminal charges based on the overwhelming evidence we had collected. They think their community's standing and family reputation will protect them from scandal, but they are unprepared for the reality that every neighbor, friend, and colleague they have deceived will soon learn the truth of how they conspired to destroy the very person who once sacrificed everything to keep them safe and secure. I remembered how Heather had once begged me for forgiveness over minor youthful mistakes, and how I had always granted it out of love. But this time there would be no absolution because betrayal of this scale cannot be undone with apologies or tears. The injustice is total because they expected me to suffer in silence as they erased my agency, but they have now been forced to confront a reality where the woman they thought too frail to fight has proven herself capable of dismantling their scheme with the same relentlessness she once used to build a life from nothing. I remained composed as the officers drove away with Jason in custody and Heather standing alone on the sidewalk clutching the restraining order, while my attorney explained that all of their actions over the past months had been cataloged in legal filings and supported by irrefutable evidence, which would soon be presented in court to ensure neither of them could claim ignorance or manipulate the narrative any further. They believed my silence meant weakness, but in reality it had been the careful quiet of a strategist building her counterattack while they grew complacent in their false sense of superiority, and now every ounce of arrogance they displayed would serve as proof of intent and malice when the prosecutors began presenting their case. I remembered every late night spent worrying about their financial troubles and every sacrifice I made to keep their lives comfortable even when it meant going without myself, and I felt a cold clarity knowing that those sacrifices had been met not with gratitude, but with schemes designed to strip me of my dignity and independence. The injustice cut deeply, because I once imagined Heather standing at my bedside in my final years as a loving daughter, yet she had plotted to confine me to a facility and enjoy my estate as if I had already died, never realizing that I would uncover every detail of her betrayal and turn it into the foundation of her downfall. I instructed my attorney to finalize the new will excluding both Heather and Jason from any inheritance while redirecting my assets to charities supporting elderly women who face similar betrayals, and I felt a weight lift as I realized that my legacy would no longer be tainted by those who had shown me only cruelty. They think they can appeal to my emotions and beg for leniency, but they have lost the right to ask for anything from me because the years I spent forgiving small transgressions had only emboldened them to attempt this final, unforgivable act of erasure. I arranged for Rosalind, my longtime neighbor and trusted friend, to manage my house while I prepared for a period of travel and reflection because I knew I needed time to heal and rediscover who I was without the constant burden of guarding against familial predators. They see themselves as victims of an overreaction, but they do not understand that the real victim has always been the woman who sacrificed her life to give them every advantage only to be repaid with lies, theft, and a plot to lock her away like an inconvenient secret. I felt no guilt as I watched Heather retreat down the street alone because I understood that this was not the end of her suffering, but the beginning of her reckoning, as every social tie she had cultivated began to unravel under the weight of her exposed betrayal. They believed they had destroyed me, but instead they had forged a woman capable of burning every bridge with precision and walking away stronger than ever before, unbound from the chains of obligation and free to live the rest of her life on her own terms. 6 months later, I sat in a quiet cafe sipping tea and reflecting on the series of events that had shattered my illusions yet restored my freedom because the legal battles were over. The house was secure, and Heather and Jason were no longer part of my life, except as cautionary tales whispered among neighbors who once admired them. Jason had been sentenced to multiple years for fraud and theft while Heather was left to face public disgrace, financial ruin, and the loss of every privilege she had taken for granted because her attempt to claim guardianship over me had not only failed but backfired so catastrophically that even her closest friends refused to defend her actions. I had learned through relentless betrayal that the bonds of blood mean nothing without loyalty and respect, and I no longer felt any need to forgive those who had viewed my love as a weakness to exploit because my survival and peace were more important than preserving toxic relationships. The greatest victory was not legal or financial but emotional because for the first time in decades I felt unburdened by the need to prove my worth to anyone, and I could finally live as a woman who made decisions only for herself, without fear of judgment or manipulation. I left the cafe with a sense of calm determination, knowing that while I had lost a daughter, I had gained something far more valuable, the unshakable knowledge that I had saved myself.